Hello and welcome once again to Stories Across Borders for the unfamiliar. Here we take some time to discuss stories across a bunch of different mediums. The one rule is that we can only discuss things in terms of storytelling. Things like art, animation, mechanics, special effects, all of that is off limits unless it directly relates to the way the narrative is expressed. My name is Daniel Radford, author, man who now understands true suffering, and also your host. And today I am joined by Blake Pingleton, who is a writer, voice actor, and narrator.
And also shares in the suffering.
Yes, you see, folks, fittingly for this cycle, which is on the theme of horror, this is the third time we've had to record this episode.
This episode, apparently the first episode is cursed.
Episodes that come after it are fine. This one specifically, as though the universe said, "Oh, you want horror? Okay," has been repeatedly the audio file has been damaged in some way, and so we're doing it again. But just bear that in mind if this one ends up being, say, a little bit shorter, or we perhaps reference things that you've never heard us say.
All right, now we just need a whiteboard for which entity is cursing our podcast episodes.
Yes.
My money is on the mer people. Anyway.
Why the mer people specifically?
Because it's a reference that they'll get in future episodes.
Oh.
Oh, this is great.
Okay.
Horror. That's
Horror.
a genre.
Sure is a genre. It's a genre that is, on paper, very weird that it exists, because horror, by definition, means it is a genre designed to scare and disgust us. So, the fact that we, like many of us, gravitate towards horror is very odd. I mean, for both of us, it is actually one of our favorite genres.
I'm, because I'm addicted to horror.
Me, just because there's a lot of good horror stories, and I like good stories. But
that also.
It is definitely strange, though, that us and others gravitate towards the genre, because it should be unpleasant. So it does make you wonder. It does make you wonder.
To be fair, life is also unpleasant.
Oh, we're getting into the philosophical stuff already this time. It took us at least 20 minutes the first two times.
Let's just get right to it, just right to the jugular. But I'm sorry, please continue.
I mean, the weird thing is that you're not entirely wrong about that being a reason for it. I think a lot of the reason people enjoy horror is because it is a controlled, safe way to experience what frightens and disgusts us.
Yes, absolutely.
So it's a way to get that thrill of being afraid or repulsed without actually having to experience such a negative thing. So you still get that satisfying catharsis at the end of it, but without ever actually being at risk.
That, or if you are into the gore aspect of horror and you get the catharsis of seeing people mutilated beyond belief.
Without committing a crime. One of those two things.
Without committing a crime, yes.
Always that enough distance from whatever horrible shit is part of the story to enjoy it without being at risk of either suffering or incarceration.
Or being on an FBI list. But yes, I would agree with you. Horror is a great genre, whether it's through written word or through movies, or especially video games, which I feel is the greatest medium to experience the horror genre.
You motherfucker.
What? There's no script.
For the confused, this is a point that I actively convinced him of in our last attempt at recording this.
This is great listening.
Fuck it, yeah, we'll dive into that right now. Why not?
I mean, we didn't have to. I was just bringing up the examples, and then you could go on to, meet. We can obviously cut this part out, but we can start with the writing and then movies and then video games. Oh, all right. This is great.
Why not? This episode's been an absolute disaster every other time. This one may as well be. No, we can get into that right now. I don't think it's gonna like distract us from anything else or whatever. Uh,
Oh, sick.
Horror in different mediums was always something that we were going to discuss. Let's just flip things around and do it earlier this time. Why not?
Sure.
Because obviously, horror is gonna be different depending on how you experience it. Because different mediums have different crutches and techniques they can rely upon. Written horror, for example, can't really use things, jump scares or any visual elements. They have to rely entirely on building up suspense and atmosphere. Whilst in your more like visual mediums or even audio mediums to an extent, you can do things with jump scares. You can use different visual tricks to change the atmosphere by making things like visibly darker, or you can do things like a favorite of mine where you have a character in frame but looking whatever direction, and have from beyond their line of sight behind them have the horror creature or the slasher or whatever approach them from behind, so it's visible to the audience but not to the victim, and that creates an interesting kind of suspense and horror that way. And yeah, then you have video games, which, as my wonderful guest has said already, I feel has a solid argument for being the best medium to communicate a horror story, because they add a additional element of agency where you have to essentially do these things to yourself, where the character is you, essentially is your representation. Even if they're a very different person, it still applies to an extent, you know. This is your representation within the game world, and you have to make the choices that actively influence what happens to you. It makes it more personal, I would say.
It's more personal, and I mean, I'm gonna dial this back for a second. Written has to have a lot more going for it than audio and further on, because if you think about it, the way art mediums have been introduced is kind of like the evolution of how stories are told, with through written word, you know, it really relies on the atmosphere and just being well written. Audio, again, it has it's kind of doubled up on what it can and get away with, and how good it can come across horror, because it has jump scares, for starters. And then we have visual, whether it be theater or movies or television, where there's not really where there's visual and audio, so you're more invested and more, what's the word I'm looking for, more emulated into
Immerse.
the horror, immersed, that was it. You're more immersed. But once you get to video games, you get that much closer to the experience without being directly in that situation.
Yeah, it's a different level of immersion because of the element of agency. Um, I think that's a good point. Is immersion is a big part of it, and like what you sort of brought up there as well, where the tools that we have available to communicate stories in general, but horror stories, have changed and evolved with as different elements of like different mediums have emerged. Like we've gone from purely written stories, which were tend to be slower paced, rely heavily on atmosphere and suspense, and thematics to an extent as well. I'd say can also be a big part in what makes things scary. It's a big part of that sort of a big part of why Lovecraftian horror worked so well, was the theming and the existentialism in it. Then you're right. You know, we have audio, which adds new elements. It would have been the first time we had jump scares. It would have been the first time we had music or background noise or foley that could communicate more about the environment in a tangible sense, almost, I guess, and things like that. And then visual mediums like television, movies, and all that had again added entirely new layers to it. And then gaming, has just sort of, again, built more and more onto that by adding yet another dimension to the way the story is communicated. And I think for horror specifically, that is a big deal because of the way you as a person are now interacting with the story in the world. And when you think of it, we now have VR coming into the equation, which takes that like step of immersion of this is you even further.
Yeah, it's interesting how technology is advancing so quickly, and we actually have virtual reality just slowly being built up over time. And there is a point to this, and I feel like we're getting closer and closer to where we can experience it without experiencing it. And I think that's something very interesting to think about.
I mean, certainly in general, but just for horror especially, like
Yes.
you can't get much closer to being in these situations without actually being in these situations than seeing it and everything being in front. Like the only step further I can imagine is if you could feel it, and that is that sounds like a horror story in and of itself. I don't think anyone wants to feel what's happening in a horror story.
I mean, some of the more courageous horror fans out there would give it a shot. I know I would.
You'd give it a shot once.
Probably. Oh man. I mean, I'm just saying horror fans have stomached many, many things, and I feel like if that opportunity was presented, I feel like it would be an interesting story medium.
It would definitely be like it would be the peak of what horror could be because there would be an actual threat to you without you necessarily actually being in danger.
Hmm.
But I don't think I want the medium to go that far. But there's definitely potential for a horror story in that concept, I must admit.
Oh, absolutely.
Uh, for sure. Definitely, medium will play a huge part. Both the evolution of mediums going forward and just the choice of medium in general is definitely going to play a huge part of how our horror stories and stories in general are told going forward. And if you're a writer, the medium you're choosing to tell your story in is going to influence a lot of the decisions you make. Like if you were going for a purely written, visual, or even audio medium, I would say in this extent, I would not suggest relying heavily on gore to be your source of horror, because it's much less disturbing when you can't see it.
It, I would say that's mostly true, but I feel like if it's done well enough, like
I mean,
if
don't. I'm
the
not saying don't include it at
atmosphere
all, but I'm
don't
saying
include.
it should be secondary, like to
Right.
atmosphere
Yeah.
and suspense. You're going to get a lot more
Okay.
mileage out of that. Yeah.
Absolutely.
To be fair, I'm not. I have some thoughts on gore and horror in general, but we'll get to that in a second.
Yeah.
Compared to more visual mediums, especially kinetic visual mediums, so film, TV, all that stuff, you're going
Hmm.
to have access. You're going to want to consider the visual environment a lot more. You're going to want to consider how dark is it, where is your creature or your slasher or your victim, whatever, in space. You're going to be able to play around with jump scares and the anticipation thereof, etc., etc., etc. And that is going to be my segue into something that I have attempted in both of these other recordings. But I must get this said: jump scares aren't bad. They are when done well, they are the perfect microcosm of what horror is supposed to be. There is the suspense, the build up, the anticipation, and then the payoff that makes the audience jump.
This message
And
was brought to you by Daniel Radford.
damn right. Uh, and if you do them well, you can then play with audience expectations because you can pull fake outs, you can draw things out or have them happen much more suddenly than people are expecting. They're great. The problem with
They
jump
are.
scares isn't that they exist, it's that people either overuse them or execute them poorly.
Yes, absolutely. I would agree with you on that.
Thank you. I'm glad someone does.
I've agreed with you 2 other times.
And I've been glad those 2 other times.
But yes, I would. I'm also just gonna keep. I'm gonna keep what he has been explaining. Yes, jump scares do work, and anyone who gets mad at them just doesn't like being scared, or or doesn't like being caught by surprise, I should say. But that is what makes what kind of helps horror along is a sudden jump, a sudden scare.
Well, I mean, that's the thing. Like, the thing that makes a jump scare work isn't just the scare at the end, it's the build up leading to it.
Yeah, I didn't have the words at the moment.
Yeah, no, I
This
get
is a
you.
team effort.
Team effort. um, but exactly, like, it's. They only work because of the use of suspense and anticipation that happens leading up to that jump. And it's by playing around with that suspense, by pulling fake outs, by toying with the audience's expectations of when the jump is going to happen, by either making it happen very suddenly after a long drawn out one or whatever, or drawing out the anticipation forever and then just not paying it off at all until way later. Like, jump scares when you play around with them and use them well, excellent. And I do think a lot of the people, like, maybe this is a bit of a hot take, but I think you were right. I think a lot of the people that are critical of jump scares just don't like being frightened by them.
Either that or they share the same feeling that they're overused.
I mean, they are
But
like they are overused. They shouldn't be a
in
crutch,
general,
but
yes. But
absolutely.
that some people overlook the fact that jump scares can be good, or jump scares are good if used properly, like you explained.
Yeah, it does genuinely irk me to see like so much of the discourse about them being purely negative because I don't get it. They're are they overused? Yes, definitely. And as we'll get into shortly, the overuse hurts them. But
No,
as a concept, I think they're fantastic, and they're one of the things that makes visual horror mediums so good.
yeah, I would
But
agree with that
but
statement.
this talk of repetition being less scary and of gore maybe not that does bring us
A transition?
a transition. Holy shit! And
It was flawless.
thank you. I've had a lot of practice.
Oh, I'm sorry. Please continue.
It does raise the question of what really is horrifying. What is horror, right? Because technically speaking, by definition, horror isn't just scary. That would be terror. But the genre is
Hmm.
called horror, and horror includes elements of disgust. And it
Yeah.
makes me feel like the genre has been misnamed more than anything because people generally associate horror with being the scary genre. But that's why gore is horror technically because by and large it's not so much scary as it is gross, and disgust is an element of horror compared to terror, which is purely about fear.
Yeah.
I mean, obviously, like if you have a phobia of blood or something, then yes, gore will be horror, like terror for you as well. But I'm talking just broad strokes. It's mostly more gross than scary, and I think it's why a lot of horror mediums, especially visual mediums, tend to not be as scary as people expect going in because they're just gore fests and spectacle, and that's not particularly scary. But there you go.
Bit of
That's why uh, hyper-violent gore is still technically horror because the
a
genre
bit of
isn't called terror, which is what we're expecting.
bit of a hot take. A lot of horror movies these days lean onto this fucking gore and the spectacle.
Oh yeah, no, for sure. I think that's true. Right. I think a lot of horror now is in is in franchises as well. And if we're going to talk about things, what makes things scary, I think we should get into the real nitty gritty of that, and that is that fear comes from two sources. There is both the unknown and the certain, and both
Yes.
contribute to fear. In the case of things, specifically, you have the unknown, which is what is this? Why is it happening? How is it happening? Not knowing things is frightening. The unknown is scary. It has been a source of fear for humanity for forever. The dark isn't scary because it's not bright. It's scary because it's concealing. That's where people who have a fear of the dark get their fear from. It's not, I can't see. It's, I can't see anything, and therefore I don't know what's out there. There could be anything. And it's a very primal thing because, of course, historically, predators, like going as far back as our caveman days, would use the dark to ambush us. So it's just built into us to have a degree of fear there.
Yeah.
And, by comparison, there is fear that comes from certainty, which is the absolute knowledge, the unshakable, oh god, what's the word? Undeniable, I guess, fact of something bad happening, which is where you get things like the fear of heights, which is something I know a lot about because I'm terrified of heights.
Guilty.
Is the fact that you fall, you're going to experience at minimum an injury. It's and that's just fact. If you get stabbed, it's going to hurt and possibly kill you. Just fact.
You're going to leak red stuff. It's going to hurt. It's going to get everywhere.
And there is certainty in that. And that's also frightening in a way. I would argue certain fear is often less scary than the unknown, but we'll get into a bit of that in a minute. I think the best horror stories, at least when they're aiming to be scary more than gross, as I would say the best horror stories do, they make use of both the unknown and certainty and blend them, and that creates the most organic primal terror. That's why pretty much all horror movies will make ample use of scenes shot at night or in dark rooms, because it preys on that primal fear of, we know, because that's what we signed up for, we know something bad is out there and something bad is going to happen, but we don't know where it's coming from or exactly what form it's going to take.
Yeah, absolutely. And the dark, I mean, again, like something we discussed earlier, it's a great way to play with expectations and to add the jump scare. I almost forgot what it was called for a second, but the dark is just a great tool of horror.
Exactly. See, this is why jump scares are good, because they are using those two elements of certainty and uncertainty and playing with them to get a result of fear. But it's also right, that element of uncertainty, I feel like, is necessary to create to like really get the reaction you want. I think it plays a bigger part than certainty, although I think the certainty does need to be there. And I think, and this is why I brought up franchises earlier, right? Is that familiarity tends to make things less scary. Like, the fear of injury or death or whatever, all that is always there. When you don't understand things, they are, just by default, because of how the human mind works, scarier. And that's why I feel like a lot of franchises over time tend to stray away from pure horror and start shifting towards being more action and spectacle oriented, because at the beginning of the franchise there is that element of the unknown and uncertainty of not knowing exactly what this is, how it's going to happen and all that. If we look back at like the first Nightmare on Elm Street, yes, it's a very violent slasher, but it is genuinely scary because you never know what Freddy's going to do. You don't know how he's going to get you, where he's going to come from. There's the tension of, oh god, they can't sleep, you know?
Mm-hmm.
And then as we move down the franchise, Freddy becomes less scary because we become familiar with who he is, what he's capable of doing, his story in general, and the stories as a result become less scary and start leaning more into the violence and the gore and the spectacle of it all. I think the third one is called like Dream Warriors or something like that, and it's specifically about fighting back.
Yeah, I mean, in some horror franchises, it is a mix of that, but it's also the writing staff just not really being able to go anywhere after the first couple of movies. Some franchises can still hang on to the horror genre like really well, but with franchises like Nightmare on Elm Street or Friday the 13th, so on and so forth, we kind of just have this uh what's the word I'm looking for? Recurring villain, right?
Yeah,
And it just boils down to this group of survivors or victims that just at this point are just sick of his shit and just try to take him down.
I mean, yeah, and again, like, but a part of that again is because telling a horror story becomes less feasible the more familiar your audience becomes with the villain, right?
Yeah.
And ultimately, the goal of the publisher or the producer or whatever is to sell books or to sell movies to put asses on seats in the theaters,
His money.
and that so the shift to action and gore and hyperviolence and spectacle is a necessity if they want to keep pushing more of that franchise out there because they can no
Yeah.
longer capitalize on the fear. I think,
No.
as we've talked about twice already, a fantastic example of this happening is the Jurassic Park franchise.
Yeah.
Especially for people who are maybe only familiar with Jurassic World and have never seen the originals. But Jurassic
I,
Park started
I
out as horror in the truest sense. It was built on suspense. It took place in the dark primarily. It had jump scares, you know. It built on a lot of horror elements. It was all about we have unleashed this like unstoppable force because of our hubris, and that force is now after us, and we can't fight back. What do we do? You know, it's it's truly it has action set like action elements, sure, but it is a horror story through and through. The second one does away with that a little bit, but it's still mostly the second one being The Lost World for anyone who doesn't know, but it's still mostly a horror story.
hmm
And then Jurassic Park 3 happened, and
It happened.
it threw away most of the horror elements. It also forgot to be good. And then, you know, years later, we got the soft reboot, which is actually a direct sequel again, where they started the Jurassic World trilogy. And by that
hmm
point, respect to those movies for being direct sequels, but also treating the third movie like it doesn't exist. Um,
Yeah.
they have some, but they're almost the inverse of horror with some action elements, right? They're action movies with some horror elements through and
Yeah.
through and through. And they're not. It's not that they're like. I wouldn't say they're bad movies. They're reasonably well written and they're exciting and they're fun, but they are definitely a departure from where everything started, and that's because we've become familiar with them. The dinosaurs aren't a source of fear for us anymore. We just want to see cool dinosaurs doing shit.
I feel at this point I would have to be the contrarian in this case because the Jurassic World movies, I, I was not sold by them. There was one specific scene uh, that was just an overextended, hyper violent scene, and it just completely turned me off. Like it was like I've seen The Thing, John Carpenter's The Thing. That was it.
Yeah.
I've seen a lot of horror movies with lots of gore, but that scene was just
Superfluous. It
unpleasant.
added nothing.
It added nothing,
I
and it was
assume.
just a disgusting
I
celebration of
yeah
hyperviolence.
yeah. I assume we're talking about when that poor assistant lady gets just brutally mauled by a bunch of pterosaurs.
Yeah. Yes.
and it's not, it's just gore. There's nothing frightening about it. It's just violence of an
For the
extreme
sake of it.
level for the sake of violence. It doesn't add anything special to the plot that it's happening. It's just spectacle. And yeah, I would agree that that wasn't a great choice, because there's nothing wrong with using gore or hyperviolence in your stories if there's a point to it. But this didn't achieve anything additional to what was already on screen.
I mean, I could
And it
go on
felt
about
and it
that.
felt kind of out of place, right, with the what was happening everywhere else in the movie.
Yes.
Yeah, I wouldn't say that one scene is enough to make the entire movie a write off for me, but it is definitely an example of the shift from horror, like true terror, I should say, in horror movies and franchises over time to being more about violence and spectacle and action.
And I would agree with you. Um, I would just say it's also a reflection of how, uh, at least in the sense of movie directors, where I feel like this may be a bit of a hot take, but directors actually care about their story back then versus just making a kaleidoscope of
Oh,
super
yeah, I
violence.
mean, that is a hot take. There's a lot of fantastic stories that
There
have come out,
there
even just the
is some
last
horror
few
stories
years.
that have been good today, but I just feel it's less so.
I would agree that there, in horror specifically, there has definitely been a bit of a drop as we've focused more on the spectacle. And I think that part of that has happened because of franchises, right?
Because of money.
Well, not just because of money,
But franchises,
but
yes.
because of the way franchises are structured, most of the content in the horror genre ends up being spectacle because of the shift happens more and more and more as the longer a franchise goes on. So
Yes.
the most of what we're looking at is the spectacle compared to the more well executed narrow amount. To be fair, though, I also do want to specify that this is a problem largely inherent to TV and film.
Right. And I won't deny that the shift is, I mean, that it's going to happen with a franchise. You know, you can't really keep the horror aspect afloat for many movies. So I will agree with you, but I do see just a little bit more than I would like about the shift.
Yeah, I understand what you mean. You like, at least when it comes to TV and movies, I would like people to go back to the fundamentals of it.
Yeah.
And you know, it has been. It's not like it's a uniform thing. It's not like all modern horror is bad. There are some brilliant examples, but I do think because of the franchise problem, we've ended up with a bit of a people are learning the wrong lessons sometimes. But again,
Yeah.
that is very specifically, I think, a TV and movie problem. I don't
I would
see
agree
it.
with you.
I don't like you see it a little bit in games,
A little bit, yeah.
but those franchises tend not to drag on as much. They usually stop, at least in horror games, after one or two games.
Well, games don't really
Usually,
usually. Um, but I feel like games don't really suffer from franchise syndrome because, I mean, the games that usually come franchises are iconic, huge titles like Mario, Legend of Zelda, you know, things that kind of hit a wide genre where everyone can get into.
yeah, you don't get
But
many horror franchises in games, and
and even if you do, it's easier to keep the horror aspect.
because it is a medium that is so well, yeah, geared towards. I don't think games are immune to the franchise problem. Uh,
I wouldn't say immune, but
we
just less so afflicted.
we
I may
later
have
on in
worded
this
that wrong.
cycle, looking into the future, do discuss a horror game for one of our episodes that does actually have this problem through the franchise.
Yeah.
But it is definitely less prevalent than in TV and movies, and I would say that it's not a problem at all for written media because franchising for horror books just doesn't really work because of the issue with familiarity in part, because you can only use the same atmospheric tools and things so many times for one creature or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
And because they're so much more long form, they get stale much easier.
Yeah.
It's interesting because we actually haven't talked about this particular story in our previous two attempts at this. But something I've noticed really recently is there is actually a story that uses this shift intentionally.
Hmm.
That is a manga series called The Promised Neverland.
Oh, I've heard of
Which
that one.
I'm reading it. I'm reading it at the moment because my sister bought me the first couple of volumes for Christmas,
Oh, what a
and
peach.
she knows my tastes. What can I say? And we won't talk about the adaptation, but what the comics do is really clever. Is that
Okay.
they use that shift of familiarity to execute a really smooth genre shift. But because it's the same characters growing, we don't have the same issue we get with, like, say, Nightmare on Elm Street. And what we actually end up getting is that it starts as a very cerebral horror story. And then, as our protagonists become progressively more familiar with the monsters, the demons, the story slowly shifts to be more of an action mystery kind of thing.
Gonna have to add that one to the list.
Yeah, it's really well done. The shift, like the horror elements, never go away, but as we become more familiar with the monsters, they become less scary to us. So too do they become less scary to our heroes as they learn ways to fight back. And the progression is very smooth and natural in the way it shifts, and uses that natural like growth of familiarity, reduction of fear concept to its advantage in its storytelling, which I can't think of off the top of my head any other story I've experienced that does this.
A horror story that seamlessly shifts action.
Yeah, not over
Yeah, I
like
can't. I
yeah, because it's not a franchise thing where we're just getting desensitized to the scariness of the enemy, because we're dealing with the same characters over this long period of time, over I believe 20 volumes, and I've just finished 10. We grow less afraid as the characters do.
hmm. Interesting way to. That's an interesting way to put it.
Yeah, it's making use of this thing that is such a problem in other franchises to the advantage of the story, which is really interesting to me.
Well, considering that on a future podcast episode, you've converted me to a specific game, I will
Uh,
definitely check out The Promised Neverland.
yeah, it's horror in particular is a genre where I feel there's a lot of really like there's a lot of absolute gems that people just forget about or don't know exist compared to other things, because it is quite niche because of the content compared to a lot of other
Hmm.
genres, and because of what we do have and readily have access to, a lot of it is franchises that suffer that franchise problem.
Yeah.
And also, a lot of the horror we're exposed to, right, is adaptations, and we don't realize that there is source material that is as good or sometimes better either. Like,
That is very true.
there's an animated adaptation of The Promised Neverland that has one season that's amazing, and then it tries to cram the remaining, like, roughly 16 volumes worth of content into one more season.
Oh.
Yeah, not good, not good at all. Or you have stuff like The Exorcist, which a lot of people don't even know started as a book. Same for Jurassic Park, actually. Jurassic Park also started as a book, and people, I feel like, don't necessarily know that, although maybe it's a little bit more widely known. What's weird is that the sequel book happened as a tie-in for the sequel movie. There was never intended to be a sequel book. So you have characters in the sequel book who died in the original who are suddenly alive again.
That's funny.
And I haven't been out. I have the book, and I haven't been able to get over that and read it as a result.
Oh no.
But yeah, The Exorcist started as a book, and it's a really good movie too. It's also a really good book that I would highly recommend. Another example is a movie I have not seen that's come out, I think last year, called Old. It's an M. Night Shyamalan
Oh,
movie.
yes, 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 yes.
Deals a lot with themes of like the inevitability of death and existentialism, and I think is a fantastic premise because it is built on just aging as a concept. It's a
Oh,
it's there's a set
it,
the basically a bunch of characters find them on a beach, and whilst they're at this beach, they suddenly start rapidly aging.
oh, I didn't know that part.
Yeah, that's why it's called Old. It's a story about growing old and the inevitability of aging and death, which is scary for most people. That actually started as a graphic novel, which I think is French, called Sandcastle.
Hmm. I think that's what you actually told me the last time.
I did, yeah.
Spoiler, that was on the second take of the podcast.
I did, yeah. I don't. I've not seen the movie or read the book, but I am intrigued by both. I'm thinking if it's available in Australia, I might try and get the book, and I'll probably
I,
give the movie a go at some point too.
I'd also like to get the book. Honest to God, I didn't even know there were book adaptations of Jurassic Park or
Not even
Exorcist.
adaptations. It started as a book.
I mean, not started is what I. Words are hard, okay.
Um,
But no, it really tears me up that I never knew about these books. So I definitely want to start collecting these books, and the story, old, it combines both, again, known and unknown terrors of like, why am I aging so quickly? Oh God, am I going to lose my mental faculties?
yeah, I mean,
So
even
on and
even
so
beyond
forth.
that, right? Even if you ignore the accelerated element of it, it deals with the very tangible uncertainty dynamic of aging and death in reality. Because there is there's the certainty, the knowledge that we will age and die. There's no getting around it. That is going to happen, but no one knows exactly how these things are going to happen. You don't know if you're going to go senile or get dementia or whatever, or if you're going to suffer, and no one knows really what happens after that moment. And I think I've said this before, I believe, but that's how you know that certain dynamic is so important to a good horror story, because the single most primal fear that humanity has is built on that dynamic. But a fun fact for you, actually, Jaws was also a book first.
Of course, it was.
Don't read the book; it's terrible.
Really?
Yeah, no, it is really bad.
Is this one of the rare instances where the book is worse than the movie?
it it is significantly worse than the movie.
That's amazing.
The movie is a masterpiece that,
The movie's
again,
great.
brilliantly uses that unknown versus certain dynamic because of how it handles, hilariously, the fact that their shark didn't work and it just benefited the execution in the long run. The book is meandering and has a bunch of weird side plots that add nothing to the story. It's not good,
Hmm.
and it manages that despite not being a long book.
It's kind of funny. I'm not gonna lie. Uh, I think what other books could we take that have representation in visual media?
I mean, it is the obvious one that comes to mind.
There we go. We hit our Stephen King quota.
We did it. We brought him up. Has to happen at least once an episode.
It has
Pet
to
Cemetery
happen.
as well, and Green Mile. Although calling that a horror is a bit. The
Pet
Mist.
Cemetery, I've heard, is a greater book than a movie.
The Shining. lot of Stephen King movies. Later became movies. I know that he doesn't like the Shining as a movie, the movie version. I still think as a
Yeah,
movie,
that's
it's a
right.
very good horror movie.
Yeah, I think it's a great movie.
It's an interesting example of horror because it's a story with a very meta element to it because it is about what makes us afraid in so many ways and how our fears change as we grow older.
Yeah, it's a great character study in a way, where these fears are kind of examined a little bit.
Yeah, well, I mean, because of course Pennywise feeds on fear and is like the embodiment of fear, right? Uh,
I mean, yeah, it
and
is also a good example of this, yes.
yeah, and as children, our fears can be a lot more out there and varied, right? That's why when his victims are children, uh, there's this. He uses a lot of different types of illusions and trickery and things like that. He appears as a clown, or he'll appear as a fountain of blood, or he'll drag you into the sewers or whatever. Like all these things like that, because these the very out there, many varied types of fears that are found in children. But later on, when the heroes are adults, later on in the timeline, not in the book, because the book jumps back and forth compared to the movies, which
Hmm.
do the children and then the adult segment separately. Just because it makes more sense to execute that way as a movie, it's fine. It isn't hurt or anything.
Yeah.
He does this a lot less, appearing in like various different guises, because as adults, it's the more existential nature of Pennywise that's scary. It's the fear of him. His
Yeah.
existence is what is scarier to them at that point than the
Hmm.
things he can appear as. So he doesn't change his shape as much when he interacts with them as adults.
Well, it doesn't really have to.
Exactly, because they're afraid of him,
I mean, to be
of
fair,
this embodiment of fear.
I would be afraid of a crazy ass clown. So
He's not even really a clown. He's
I know.
three little like globs of light orbiting each other or something.
Uh, that's yeah.
But I do like that sort of meta level to the story, where as the characters grow older, they become more afraid of the threat that Pennywise himself represents, both because it shows becoming more afraid of the existential level of being afraid of what he represents, not just
Hmm.
at the level of being representative of fear, but of this horrifying universe beyond what we can experience generally. And also just because he's a more tangible, immediate threat to them, as opposed to some strange out there thing.
Well, it's also interesting, it in general, and I'm gonna dial back to a specific. It's interesting, that to see that children's fears are magnified greatly because they're children, so they hardly understand anything. So it's really interesting to see these characters as children and see them develop into the sort of people that they grow up into.
Yeah, I mean, I like that you brought that up as well, because there's an element of meta-ness to that too, of we're seeing the certain uncertain dynamic play out on paper or on the screen. Because as
Absolutely.
children, you're less familiar with the world, and by default, that makes the world scarier in some ways and less scary in others. And, you know, the flip side of that coin, of course, is that some things as an adult, because you now understand them, they're not scary, whilst other things, because you understand them, they now are. Uh,
Absolutely.
but I also like that you've mentioned the use of children in horror because, as we have tried to talk about before, there are like a lot more horror stories focus on children than others do for an adult target audience. Like, I think the number of children centered stories in horror is very disproportionate compared to the number of children consuming those stories. Now, as I've discussed before, part of that is just because as adults we can relate to the experience of children much easier than children can relate to the experiences of adults because we've been children and children have not been adults. It's that simple. But I think the reason horror stories, despite mostly being aimed at adults, you know, exceptions exist. There's the entire Goosebumps franchise and everything, which is obviously horror aimed at children. But as a
Hmm.
general rule, most horror stories are aimed at adults.
Yeah.
So I think the reason that those stories use children as their central characters so much is because vulnerability adds to horror. And children are not just humans at their most vulnerable in many ways, but are also vulnerable in a vulnerable demographics that we societally and as a species are conditioned to want to protect from harm. So
I
seeing
would,
these bad things happen to children like triggers something in like the adult brain that, oh god, this is so wrong, which adds to the horror.
yeah, absolutely. I would also go on that when it's a child that's the center focus, because like if it's an audio or visual medium, right? I feel like it's more easier for an adult to emulate themselves into that scenario, and it kind of quasi puts them back in a certain state of mind, just to better emulate that their own past
Yeah,
fears and
if you
whatnot.
if you're immersed enough, you're going to be in the mindset of that child character, and that will
Yeah,
increase the fear because of in the mindset of that character, a child is more vulnerable. That makes a lot of sense.
right.
I think that's a fair point. Because like when you think about it, like obviously, even if it's not an intentional thing, obviously so many horror writers have to be aware of this and are doing this, or at the very least are unintentionally doing this, because you've got like Poltergeist centered around a child, Nightmare on Elm Street, and they're not children, they're teenagers. Actually, they're like 40-year-olds playing teenagers, but they're still young people. Uh, it focuses on children. Under the Dome, I mean, calling that horror is a little bit, but
Chucky.
a lot of children characters. Chucky victimizes children quite a lot. I've talked about this story in both of my previous attempts at doing this, but there's a Stephen King take a shot story by him called The Girl Who Loves Tom Gordon, who is entirely centered around a child who gets lost in the woods and is way too vulnerable to be in this situation and completely incapable of handling the situation. She does not have the skills or experience or maturity to really deal with it, and is so that on its own is already frightening. And then you throw in the fact she's being pursued by something. So we have this vulnerable child who's being pursued by something that is either a bear or like the god of death and fear. One of those two things. It's never entirely clear if it's just a bear and there's nothing supernatural going on, and the supernatural elements are just because she's dehydrated and dealing with like exposure and all that, so her brain's just fried, or if there is actually a supernatural element. But it doesn't really matter. The point, I mean, that's a great use of the certain uncertain elements and all over again. But because the story is focused on a child, it makes it feel so much more deadly because of that vulnerable element. And it's just that's present in just so many stories. Like I've done it.
Yes, you have. You sick bastard. Anyway, uh, I would say that the key word when having a child, quote unquote, protagonist for a horror story is ambiguity. And
Oh,
I think that's what does it really well with with that last story.
I'm curious as why you say like children and ambiguity because like
Well, I mean,
for me
ambiguity in the sense of the unknown.
that's
Like,
true. I suppose you're tying it into that like this notion that there is so much more unknown. So when you're in the mindset of I
yes.
I think that certainly must play a part. Yeah. Although again, for me, it's more about the vulnerability element, and because of the way we're conditioned as
Well,
people to want to defend our young.
to be fair, vulnerability just comes with the territory with children because children by default are vulnerable.
Exactly.
I mean, unless you're in a sci-fi universe where this kid is basically Master Chief Jr. No, I feel
Was
like
that an Ender's Game reference?
I don't know what that is.
I
So
mean, I've not
no.
read the books either, but But yeah, I get what you mean. Yeah, I mean, that's exactly what I've been saying is that just by
Yeah.
virtue of who they are, not only is the
Hmm.
world scarier to children, but they are by default more vulnerable to the world or whatever horrors are out there in your fictional universe. So that adds to the fear and the horror just by virtue of their vulnerability, but also because, again, we're conditioned to want to shield those vulnerable members of our society.
For the most part.
Yeah. I mean,
Uh,
unless you're like us and would and take pleasure from just yeeting children off cliffs.
unless you're a terrible person. Oh, this is going to be a great first episode for the rest of it.
Well, the good news is that there's plenty of cycles before this one that have exposed the audience to how terrible a person I am. But they get
The
to
good news
experience your
is,
brand of awfulness for the brand new.
ooh, the good news is that this was late into the episode, so if you've listened thus far, you're guaranteed to listen to the rest of it.
I hope. The rest of it actually not being much longer because I think we've pretty much covered everything we need to cover.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah.
so, on that note, you have survived attempt number 3, audience. Congratulations. We've made it to also a plus.
No. We survived take number 3. They're just hearing this
You're
for the
right.
first time.
What
Be
am I
like,
talking about?
what the,
They've only had to do
what the,
this once.
what the fuck are they bitching about?
Yeah, so that's where we're gonna leave it. You can, of course, find more of these podcast episodes on Spotify or Google Podcast. If you're already there, you can find them and more of my work on my website radfordwrites.com, where which links to my Twitter and YouTube and stuff as well. But I share a lot of the transcripts of the stories I write for these episodes there and everything, and you can get links to my books there and all that. You can also follow me on Twitter at DanielWright7, where I occasionally tweet about stuff. And of course, you will be able to find Blake there as well.
You can find me at twitter.com as it's slowly crumbling to pieces. You can find me at the handle at RealMerkmeyer, although I'm not sure how long Twitter will exist. So if you want to find me outside of the rubble of Twitter, you can find me on YouTube as Merkmeyer.
You're on Twitch too, right?
I am. Twitch TV/Muckmeyer. That's MUKMIRE.
Yeah, and you'll probably see more of him again, or at least hear more of him again on my various projects as well. Until
Uh-huh.
then, you will be seeing him again next week as we continue the horror cycle. We'll see you guys there.